This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
The whole original purpose and creation of the modern art styles we see, it was meant to disrupt our traditional culture and beliefs and replace them with the modern ideologies of socialism, things like that.
This is America Daily. I'm Mark Jackson. Contemporary art is difficult to define. The social message or idea behind a project is often emphasized at the expense of technique. Sometimes it is so simple and straightforward that you wonder if you're missing something. So how did we go from Da Vinci to what we have today? And what motivated that change? Today's guest asked himself that question, and what he has to say might surprise you. Tim Gebhardt writes about art and history. Tim, thanks for joining us. Recently, you wrote an article about socialism's link to the modern art movement. Could you explain what role art played traditionally?
If we look at museums, they really lay this out well in terms of trying to understand what role art played in history. Like if you go to a museum, first it starts out, usually 2000 BC or, further back, and then it goes up into our present era. And in each era, all the artworks are grouped together. So you can kind of see the progression, of society as it's going through the ages. And it reflected the world back to us and showed our relationship to it. So for example, there's a lot of just basic things, about daily life, pottery, things like that are ornamented, decorated. And then there's also a lot of statues and little figurines of deities and gods and things like that. So what they were doing in those situations was they were taking their experiences in the world and basically consecrating it into this earth here. And what's interesting about this is that if you read some of the stories in, ancient China, for example, or, you go back to the ancient Greek history, there's a lot of cases where people have actually seen these deities. They've seen them, had visions, dreams, or whatever, and then they reproduce them. So one example I really think is interesting is in the Mogao caves in China. There is a Buddhist monk. He was a wandering monk, and he had a vision as he was walking through the Xinjiang province, desert, and he saw all these Buddhas and celestial maidens and things like that. And, it led him to a vision to this cliffside where he painted exactly what he saw. So you see that a lot, angels, everything like that. From the society, that's what they left behind. And that's basically a lot of their artwork. You can tell that that's their main focus in life. The vast majority of the artwork is dedicated to spirituality because, they had a different way of thinking about the world than we do now. But generally, if you look at the role art played traditionally, it was to basically recapture the world as people have seen it.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like art played a similar role in ancient cultures all over the world. They all used it to express divine themes. What about Western culture? What role did art play in the West? And was it different at all?
In Western culture, painters and sculptors, they originally adhered to the principles of truth, goodness, and beauty. And these are the Socratic roots of Western civilization, basically. And this goes back to Plato, all that. They're the ones that originally penned these, what they're called the transcendentals, the three aspects of the human fields of wisdom, or basically they're like principles, truth, goodness, and beauty. And these are really the pillars of Western civilization and what it originally stood on in terms of us trying to understand the world we live in, human fields of wisdom. Within these principles was our desire towards divinity. So these three principles would lead us toward it if we follow it. Like this is basically like the roadmap for them of how to be a perfect human being, basically, in the human realm. So if you go back into, ancient Greece, things like that, they really highlighted perfection in their artwork and architecture. They saw humanity first and foremost as spiritual beings. And then, if we go throughout history, we see that medieval Christian philosophers take this idea, the transcendentals and the foundations, being the ultimate desire of mankind, the three principles, again, truth, goodness, and beauty. It was like a curriculum of how we understood the world.
So spirituality was an important aspect of art until fairly recently. How and when did art's role change from revering the divine to today's modern art?
So there's a lot of cast of characters involved here, and a lot of things took place that led to this. But I can start with how art shifted from revering and respecting the divine to what it is today. Modern art, all the different modern art movements we see, that actually happened with the rise of socialism. Around 1770, Baron de Halbach, he was a French-German author and philosopher. He was a very influential figure, during the Enlightenment era in France, and he wrote the book, The System of Nature, and it was published around 1770. In the book, Halbach touted atheism, materialism, and scientific rationalism as the means and methods of understanding the world. So we go from the transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty, which were the foundations of art and what it was built upon, to atheism, materialism, scientific rationalism as a means of understanding the world. So the differences in the art movements are shocking because these two different motivations or foundations are so shocking. And this is actually a deliberate attempt to hack away at the roots of Western civilization. The whole original purpose and creation of the modern art styles we see, it was meant to disrupt our traditional culture and beliefs and replace them with the modern ideologies of socialism, things like that. During the first French Revolution, they started to de-Christianize France because of, these different philosophies that really took hold. And it also, freeing people from the yoke of moral restraints. The theories of anarchy, communism, utopian socialism, atheism, all that spread in the cafes and salons in France. And these were hot topics by, the cultural elite and also artists. So several artists were among the ranks that would lead the charge in implanting these new isms, into French society. So different communes were set up and things like that, and it really took hold. Among these people were Edouard Manet and Gustave Courbet, and they were the founders of the modern art movement. I mean, this is where it began right here. There's also early Impressionists involved, Monet, Cézanne. They were also leading figures in bringing their ideas into the art scene. But Gustave Courbet, he was one of the most outspoken members of the modern trends in art. So he was a staunch atheist, anarchist. He was one of the leading figures in the Paris Commune uprising in 1871. He adhered to the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, which was published in 1848, basically laying out the stratagems to pretty much bring a totalitarian system of government, with obviously them being in charge. In France, this was the big thing. The bourgeois had to be taken down. They were the cultural, political elite. He really used this as like kind of a foil to kind of press his ideas into society. He caused a lot of outrage when he introduced his paintings into the academies and salons where they would, exhibit the works. A lot of his paintings really showed demeaning, immoral subject matter that really outraged the public. He had his famous prostitute paintings, Olympia. It caused such outrage that the National Guard had to be called in because the French public, they could not take it. It was just too provocative. And that's how he got famous, basically. By outrage alone does he become famous. So the art academies and salons refused a lot of the Impressionist works, and the realists too, by Manet and Courbet, because of their very insensitive subject matter. They would paint prostitutes, absinthe drinker, I think that was by Manet, just people getting drunk, basically pornographic images. And all of it was meant to incite rage by the general public, against his works. How this got to be mainstream, after so much outrage, was that he had friends in influential places. Basically, Emperor Napoleon III was a friend of Courbet. He was the monarch of France, basically. And he took pity on the Impressionists and also the Realists and set up the Salon de Refus to exhibit Courbet and his friends' works that were rejected by the traditional salons. So, over time, with the help of Napoleon III, they were able to basically isolate the traditional art academies and salons in France. And they isolated them through smear campaigns. They were very vicious towards the, what they would call old-fashioned, out-of-touch, stifling, and sentimental academies of the day. They used the argument to the camera. Well, no, the camera's invented. We don't need this, your type of artwork anymore, because that frees us up from portraying things realistically. They really, really went heavily after the traditional academies, and eventually just replaced them altogether. The French public, they basically persuaded them, after a decade or two of the propaganda that, well, maybe this new impressionist stuff is hip and in vogue, and if I like that old stuff, maybe I'm just old fashioned, or all these old fashioned values that go with it. This is the new modern thing, impressionism and all that stuff. So it seems, if you look at the impressionist works, you see, like colorful gardens and ponds and all that stuff, but behind it, some impressionists are decent people, but there were the few main ones there that really intentionally tried to antagonize the traditional art scene and went after it to try to replace it. And just to throw this once again, this was deliberate. It was a deliberate attempt to take a Western civilization and turn it up on its head. The arts and our relationship to art is very key in maintaining our moral values and societal structure. All of our institutions, values, and everything up to that point, they're very heavily dependent upon our understanding of the divine, which goes back into truth, beauty, and goodness. Those are the roots. All that kind of ties into the arts, as being the vessel to understand the divine. So that's why you see the cathedrals, everything like that. So much effort was poured into creating beautiful, masterful works of architecture and art. So in Western society, it was so key, the visual experience in the world. And so these communists, when they were trying to take hold of society at the time, they knew that. And so they tried to knock down in one blow, just like boom, they were able to topple the entire system we had basically of, Western civilization and its foundation. We don't have the strength that we did in the morality and everything like that. So basically that's what toppled, our whole moral structure, everything, beliefs, all that started to decay. And then all these different social ideas and everything like that, moral relativism, atheism, everything like that started to take hold and really shape our society to what it is today.
I think a lot of people would be shocked by what you just said, that the purpose of modern art from the very beginning was to undermine Western culture. So what effect has this had on our culture today?
They knocked out all the competition, all the traditional art academies, everything like that, all the techniques, everything, they were buried. Basically, they went into exile. So the new, more modern deviant styles, they had free reign in society. And they were all completely influenced by communist beliefs. And they basically ridiculed traditional morality left and right. Prostitute paintings, they were the big thing. The absinthe drinker of Manet, the ear-mutilated self-portrait of Van Gogh, that we're all familiar with. These people led very deleterious lifestyles. They had a lot of bizarre behaviors, influenced by their beliefs. They're described as unhinged derelicts. They visited brothels, did a lot of drugs. They had a very morose and nihilistic outlook on life, going back to the systems of nature. Human beings were just a random collection of, happenstance. So any kind of moral structure, it's basically if people are reduced to just physicality, then that's all that matters. So they go right after physical pleasure. I mean, that's all that life was physical pleasure to them. And these lifestyles soon became, viewed as, this is the way artists are supposed to be, so it was risque and fashionable. You have your hippie art teachers now displaying, at least in my day, displaying these kind of behaviors. It's kind of the cool hip thing to do, kind of like the beatnik artist, live this dour lifestyle that, morose and all that stuff. And that's the way artists were seen. But along with the artists themselves, soon being fashionable, their artwork was also fashionable. It basically became mainstream. And with that, Western Europe, the United States, it happened later, after World War II, but in Western Europe around the 1850s, 1870s-ish, society rapidly deteriorated. Traditional morality plummeted to a frightening degree. Belief in God was considered a quaint superstition. People lived without duty to society or their families. The main focus for a human being then was just pleasure. So duty, things like that, begin to take a back seat. Any hindrances toward pursuing their hedonistic desires were viewed as attacks on freedom. So there's really no way you could really go against them and try to limit their, lifestyle, because if you did, you say, well, you're going against my rights as a human being. And now it's such a big theme in modern society, and it has its roots in these early beliefs, of that Courbet and his friends were touting systems of nature right there. That's where it originated. Just the hedonistic, nihilistic way of looking at the world, or materialistic way of looking at the world, and also a scientific rationalism. And that was another big key there too, is that with scientific rationalism, it's only what your five senses can perceive. That's reality. In a way, it takes out morality again. With just the five senses, morality has no real place in society then. You can't really make a justification for it, because it's basically saying, well, my life is just this material blob. So morality is just constructed by mankind. It can be adjusted as needed. And, so that doesn't have that imparted from the divine that morality used to have. It was imparted by the divinity to humanity. Now it's just constructed by humanity. So it easily took a downward spiral into what it is today. But if you look at the new modern art movements, abstractionism, Fauvism, there's Dada art, Cubism, Surrealism, pop art. So these all came from those movements. Is the stripping down of those moral restraints, everything like that these beliefs were trying to disseminate through society, just one after another, that led to these different art movements now where it's kind of can't really recognize what it is. It's so distorted from reality. And that's because the artists creating it, their mindsets were so distorted from reality. Any kind of basis in any kind of traditional thought, the ancients would abhor, because it's basically slapping human dignity in the face. Going back to that museum kind of example, as we go through the history here and look back at it, in art museums, you go from traditional, ancient stuff up to the Renaissance, Baroque, and then the Impressionists onto modern art. It's basically a journey from the sacred to the profane, in short, just to sum it up in one sentence.
Many radical artists from the 1800s and 1900s, like Picasso, Van Gogh, and Manet, are now well respected, and a lot of arts education is focused on them. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so you go into art classes in our public school systems now, in universities especially. Van Gogh and Picasso are basically the pinnacle of the arts, and this was by design by them, because they basically took absolute control of the art establishment, in France in the 1850s, and that continued on into them controlling the art establishment. The modern art movement basically has been the pinnacle of art since the 1850s on up to the modern era here. It's funny because, they were, basically lunatics at the time. Basically, they were kind of like these loungy people, and they came from the upper crust of society. I mean, they had a lot of money. They had influential friends. They were part of that intellectual elite, but we were taught to really idolize them. These were the artists. Look at their expression. Look at Starry Night. Look at Picasso and his prostitute paintings and things like that. And that became what students thought art was all about. This kind of morose, nihilistic world that they led and all that stuff, and that was mainstream. Their behavior and everything, it really shaped the upper crust of society and our values and everything like that. So in terms of art education, we lost a lot of the techniques from the traditional academies. In France, they were set up by King Louis XIV, as way of quality control. Art had to be the best. It took decades, in a lot of cases, to really master the techniques in oil painting, drafting, everything like that. Whereas in modern art, it's just based on feeling. You just go to a piece of paper and throw stuff on it, and it's all about feeling. Technique. Courbet, all those. Manet said, technique was this kind of, it was too restrictive for them. It wasn't about capturing the impression. That wasn't the intent of it. The intent of it was to challenge the traditional art movement. So it was antagonizing. Basically, them trying to warp things to basically create shock. I mean, that was their whole intent. So That's what comes out in their motives, basically. So basically, in our modern world, we see a lot of dysfunction now, and a lot of that came from, this impressionists and also, the modern art movements. So they basically succeeded in their goal of knocking out traditional morality. They wanted us to see the past as old-fashioned, irrelevant, full of naivety. As our culture indulges more in these behaviors flaunted by the impressionists and their successors, we really delve further into their narrow ways of thinking, focus purely on the material world and basically our losses and gains within it. Our wisdom has been reduced to a very narrow plane of thinking in this physical world. So you can take a look, you'll see it. You read any book from 1800s on before, and people had these really broad ways of thinking and of understanding the world. And it's basically now it's just right into like this only material way of looking at the world. And that's basically art education, everything like that. That's really pushed this narrow way of thinking, and that's where we are today.
All of this sounds pretty dark. What can people do with this information?
Art played a very critical role in maintaining moral and upright society. Art can still have that effect if we understand the effect art plays in our society, basically. So we know how important it is, then, we can create a healthy, respectful society, that cherishes life in Western society. Again, because, art is so influential in Western society, has such an important role to play. It can create that downward or upward spiral very easily. So, if we produce positive artwork becomes mainstream, society's going to go with it.
Thanks for joining us, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
What do you think of today's modern art and its influence? Please let us know at americadaily.com. Once again, I'm Mark Jackson. Thanks for listening. This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.